Hey everyone, it's Dr. Erin here, one of the good doctors of Abbey Research, and I am here with my fourth and final video celebrating Native American Heritage Month, which is a designated month here in the United States during November. If you've missed my three previous videos, fear not. There is a link below to the playlist where I've given a little bit of an introduction to what Native American Heritage Month is. I've talked about some awesome book recommendations. Last week I did some podcast recommendations. And up for today's video is another more contemporary, more recent way for us to learn and experience different voices, the wonder that are TED Talks. So I have done a little bit of research on the internet and found 3 TED Talks that I want to recommend to you today. And then I've included a list below with a whole host of other ones that I found on YouTube that I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. Oh, I'll watch that one next. So I've made the list for you. So the first one I want to talk about is one done by Valerie Segrist, talking about food sovereignty at TEDx Rainier, which is in Washington State. Valerie is a member of the Muckleshoot tribe and a native foods educator and community nutritionist. And so basically what her TED Talks does is explains exactly what food sovereignty is and why it's important to Native and Indigenous communities. So food sovereignty is considered the right of a community to define its own diet and shape its own food system. And this is particularly significant, she argues, for Native and Indigenous communities because their native and original food systems were very often disrupted, disturbed, erased, destroyed, and changed by colonization. So it is, food sovereignty is, she thinks, a part of tribal sovereignty and protecting the original ways of whichever Native and Indigenous group and wherever they are living in the United States, which would dictate a different sort of food system and food diet. So she talks about all of this as a relationship to land and to culture and to their ancestors and traditions, and that food sovereignty is linked in with that. So it's a really, really interesting talk. And particularly because the American holiday of Thanksgiving is coming up next week, I definitely wanted to include one of my TED Talks about food sovereignty. And I've also included some links below to the Oglala Lakota Sioux chef, Sean Sherman, who has published a book called The Sioux Chef and is an Indigenous foods rights activist and is attempting to decolonize Native and Indigenous food here in the United States. So there's some links down below in the show notes to that as well, and some discussions about what Thanksgiving means as an American holiday, how it is deeply problematic to Native and Indigenous communities, particularly given the myth of Thanksgiving that we have created, and some different ways that you can consider celebrating sharing food with your loved ones while being socially conscious about these issues. So up next for my second TED Talk video is one that I found from Tara Hauska called The Standing Rock Resistance and Our Fight for Indigenous Rights, which was at TEDx Women event in 2017. Tara is a tribal attorney and Couchiching First Nation citizen, and she kind of grounds her argument in the erasure of Native and Indigenous rights around the Standing Rock Sioux protest and resistance site that was about the North Dakota pipeline access. I forget what the acronym was, but about the movement of a pipeline through Native and Indigenous lands in North and South Dakota that has been a protest and resistance movement for, I think, about 5 years now. So she talks about this idea of resistance and how it is so important within Native and Indigenous communities to activate, to be activists for themselves and to speak up in these situations. She talks a lot about representation and the power that collective resistance can bring to a movement. So it was really, really interesting, and I thought she spoke very eloquently about something that we may be a little bit more familiar with, since that is one of the more recent protests that made a lot of news around here. So my third and final TED Talk is by a man named Craig Deal. It's called Indigenous in Plain Sight, and it was at the TEDx Boulder event in 2018. And Greg is a husband, father, artist, and member of the Pyramid Lake Paiute tribe. And he kind of uses this TED Talk to talk about his own artistic sensibilities and how that developed in relationship to his Native identity and heritage. And it's a really, really interesting short talk about his performance art and how he uses that to kind of contest an art world that makes a lot of demands about what it is to be Native or Indian or Indigenous, and what people expect those representations to look like when you go into a gallery in Santa Fe, versus some of the more unknown realities facing Native and Indigenous communities and their histories on this land. So it's really, really cool. He talks about the power of stories, and he challenges everyone who listened to his talk to do something with the stories he gave them, which is kind of, I thought, a culmination of what I'm attempting to do with these videos for Native American Heritage Month, is hopefully provide a list for some stories that you may not have heard and some histories that you don't know. And I challenge you to do something with them, even if it's just to continue to educate other people and inform them about some of these very serious and real and significant issues facing the wide and expansive existence of Native and Indigenous communities and cultures, both in the United States and in North America and all over the world. So that is all I have for you for this Native American Heritage Month TED Talks recommendation. Almost said podcasts, not podcasts. TED Talks recommendations video. And that is everything for our Native American Heritage Month coverage from Abbey Research. But I will be intentionally including a lot more information and articles and links to things throughout the year, because as I said in my original video, these months are important because they give us an opportunity to shine a spotlight on something that is not normally given much attention to, but the duty is on us to carry on that inquisitive and curious nature throughout the whole year. It is Native and Indigenous Heritage Month all the time, because Native and Indigenous people live with us and work with us and exist in the world that we live in all the time. So this will not be the last of our coverage, but the last of this video for now. I hope you've enjoyed something and learned something, but for now, I am Dr. Erin, and I will see you in our next video. Take care.